So that's a perfect launching point for today, as our story begins with baptisms. For those of you who saw it on Facebook or maybe got the phone notification on our app, if you don't have that, go ahead and give that a download, the Rise Church app. It's got announcements and it has a Bible embedded in it. It's got all kinds of things, sermon replays. But if you didn't get those, today we're going to be talking about the woman at the well when Jesus was going through Samaria. So let's continue this series, Unsure, by looking at the story of when the woman at the well met Jesus. So this is in John chapter 4, and it's we're just going to kind of give the summary of the story today. The scripture's on the screen. If you want to take a picture, if you haven't read it recently, I highly encourage you. Take it home with you and read through it. There's a lot of stuff that we won't be able to get through today. That's just the meaning. That's just the way that things are on a Sunday morning when we have such a short time together. So it begins when Jesus heard that the Pharisees found out he was making and baptizing more followers than even John did before he was arrested, because at this point he is in prison. So Jesus left Judea and headed north for Galilee. Now, sandwiched in between these two countries, essentially Judea and Galilee, is Samaria, right in the middle. Most Jews would have gone around Samaria because the Jews and Samaritans really despised each other, but Jesus chose to go straight through instead. Now, the reason that they despised each other was that Israel, if you know Israel's history well, some of this may be already familiar to you, but if you don't, Israel was actually split in two. At a certain point in its history, they had a moment when they decided to part ways. There were wars, there were invaders, all kinds of things, and they became the nations of Israel up north and Judah in the south. Eventually, the north was even overtaken by outsiders. Samaria was actually a region that was kind of set aside, and I believe it was the king of Assyria, he actually sent back people to live there who were not Jews. And so the Jews intermarried with them, which was against God's commandments, because it would be harder to stay faithful if other religions, other cultures started taking over their daily lives. So this was Samaria. These were considered half-bloods. Very harsh way to look at it, but that was exactly how they looked at it. That's why the Jews typically crossed the River Jordan, went north, and then cut back west again to avoid ever contacting these people, which is unfortunate on a lot of levels. But Jesus chose to break that mold and go straight through Samaria because he came for everyone. He did not come to continue traditions of isolation and casting people out. So that is the background on Samaria and who this woman came from. So around noon, one day of their journey, he sent his disciples into town to get food while he rested at a well. When they were gone, a woman came up to the well to draw water for her household. For those of you who are perhaps a little younger, like my 3-year-old son, we didn't always have sinks. People had to actually walk a long ways and bring jars, fill those up, and bring them back. My parents do that on occasion up at our place in Wisconsin because in the wintertime we shut off the water and because pipes freeze because it's really cold up there. So I've had a little taste of this, and it's not fun. So she had to do this very regularly. Everyone had to do that regularly. So she went to draw water for her household at this well where Jesus was sitting. When she got there, he asked her for a drink of water as he had nothing to draw up his own drink, and he was thirsty from his travels. That kicked off a rather deep conversation. They began with water at his request, but they moved through cultural animosity, Jews and Samaritans, sinful living, their shared lineage and history, proper worship and changes that were coming to worship, affirmation that salvation does come from the Jews, because that's where Jesus was. Jesus was a Jew. That's how God chose to reveal himself to us. And her people, the Samaritans, longing for the Messiah. Finally, Jesus reveals to her, after all of that he is the Messiah she was hoping for. Now, that was an awful lot for them to talk through, but we only get 20 verses of it. Whether that means the conversation was actually that short and they just talked really slowly maybe, or if some of it was maybe cut down, we don't know for sure, but I imagine it was probably longer because it encompassed more or less the whole time the disciples traveled into town bought food, and walked back. So it probably took longer than it would take us to read 20 verses. But we still, even in 20 verses, get an awful lot to chew on. So the disciples return as they finish their conversation there at the well, and the disciples are amazed that he's sitting there talking to a Samaritan woman. Does that sound familiar to anyone, by the way? Samaritan woman? Take it away, Samaritan woman, listen to what I say. No? Yeah. There's a Christian parody band who does kind of sometimes awful parodies, but I wish that they would have done that one at some point, because it's a perfect fit. American Woman is the original, if you don't know the song. So now that we've gone through this story, we know kind of the overall arc, the pattern of what happens. Let's spend some time actually looking at the woman herself. First, she was real. How was she real? First, she understood who she was. She understood who she was. What time did I say Jesus arrived at the well? It's about noon, okay? Anyone here ever have any farming background? Grew up on a farm? Got a couple of hands going up? Yeah. If you had a time of day that you don't want to be exerting energy, spending time outside under the sun, what time is that? It's the afternoon. Why? Because the sun is high, the sun is hot, the temperatures go up. Even if you're not a farmer, you understand it's hottest in the afternoon. I think 2 to 4 is about average through the year. We're in its hottest. So they arrived at the well sometime around noon, and she arrived sometime after that. She's walking. She's carrying things. What time is she going to be walking and carrying things once she gets her water? The heat of the day. So she'd have to walk all the way home, not just walking, but also carrying very heavy jars. How many here fill up water jugs for home, like at the store? You get the dispensers. Or maybe you exchange bottles, big bottles, 5-gallon jugs. Those are not light, are they? And those are plastic. She didn't have plastic. Plastic is lightweight. So you've got all that water. Whatever it is that's heavy enough and sturdy enough back then to carry that water, she's carrying a lot of weight during the heat of the day. Not a good time. Now, has anyone ever left a cup or a bottle of water out on the porch or at a picnic table for a while? I know I have. What happened to it after a while? It got warm. People don't like drinking warm water typically, right? Would it get warm as quickly if it were 4 a.m. versus 4 p.m.? No. Time of day makes a difference. The sun is out and the ambient temperatures rise as the day goes forward. So what's likely to happen if she gets water in the afternoon rather than in the morning? It's less likely they'd have the benefit of cool water at the household. So why in the world was she coming to the well in the afternoon? Why would she do this? Well, pun intended. Pause for effect. A couple of people get it. Well, she came to draw water in the afternoon because she was not welcomed in polite society. Traditionally, in societies where women draw water from wells, they do it together and in the early morning for the reasons we just talked through. But she was the sort of person the other women in the town did not want around them. So she had to come into the wilderness by herself, which was not safe. Wild animals, perhaps men at the side of the road, who knows, by herself in the heat of the day when no one else was there. It's like being a child back in the day before we had access to a lot of running water. You know, they didn't back then. You know where the term ringleader comes from? Some people, I heard a laugh somewhere. It's the first person who gets to take a bath in clean water. You ever look at the edge of the tub after a bath? There's a ring. The ringleader gets the clean water. The child who's least important in the family goes last. I'm glad that we have showers. Very glad. So, or maybe it's like the nerd in college if you have to shower after the hot water's gone. That's not fun either. It's not nasty, but it's cold. It's unpleasant. She was an outcast. She lived as an outcast, even among a society of outcasts. She was not welcome. She understood who she was, and like it or not, this was her life. Then this Jewish man comes up asking for water, and he's supposed to be pompous and condescending, and she understood who she was, or she thought she did. And imagine she didn't like the life that she had in this moment. So she knew who she was. She was also honest with herself. During the conversation, Jesus tells her that he has living water to give, and anyone who drinks it will never thirst again. Imagine having to trek miles every day to get your water and go home. Imagine if you had water at home that you didn't have to trek and carry, because you'll never thirst again. He said that, and then after some back and forth, she asks him for that water so that she will never thirst nor have to come back to draw water. Makes sense. While that might have been sarcastic on her part, we can't know for sure, as we're not told her tone of voice or other details that would give us a clue into her meaning. It's kind of unfortunate. We just kind of get the straight text, which isn't always helpful for us to understand all the details. But sometimes God doesn't give us all the details. Sometimes he gives us just what we need, and we have to trust him for the rest. The Bible is that way too sometimes. Sometimes we get only what is required. One day we'll know more. We won't be all-knowing because that's God's thing, but we have what we need. So, while that may have been sarcasm, she does at least recognize that there are good things she doesn't have. And if those things were before her, she wouldn't be too proud to ask for them, not even from a strange Jewish man. And when Jesus asks her to go to bring back her husband, she tells him that she has no husband. He knows that just as well as she does. He's God. This is kind of his thing. And this was a God-ordained moment, and he had the proverbial dossier on her with all the info he needed to know how to gain access to her heart that day. Now, he replies that she's truthful, and she's indeed had 5 husbands, but the man that she's with now is not her husband. What a moment. This stranger she doesn't know just told her some of the most intimate details of her life. That would make me sit up and take notice. She knew she knew what was right, and that's presumably why she tried marrying 5 times. But she seems to have just given up at some point and gone with what she wanted without what she knew she needed to be right with God. She knew her life was wrong, and she didn't lie to herself about that. She was honest with herself, which is different than being honest with other people. Very different. A lot of people try to be honest with other people, but they're not honest with themselves. It changes a lot when you can be honest with yourself. She was also honest with others about herself. She not only was honest with herself about her life of sin, but she was also honest with Jesus. Even before she realized she had no secrets from him and that God sent him, she told him that she had no husband. She didn't know that he had those insights, but she told him she had no husband. Perhaps this was partly due to the embarrassment that would follow if she said she was living with a man who wasn't her husband. Maybe he saw her in town at some point or something. But it was still the truth, regardless of her motivation for being honest with him. And that was a truth that Jesus used to dig deeper. If you look at their whole conversation, she really never held back. Right from the start, she pointed out that by tradition, they shouldn't be speaking. Why do you ask me for water? Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans. She wasn't afraid to tell this man that he had no bucket to draw water, despite his claim that he could give her water. She even challenged his right to any water immediately nearby, as this was a well passed down to her people from the days of their forefather Jacob. She was nothing if not truthful with him. So she was real. That was the first thing. Second, she engaged. She engaged. She thought she knew who Jesus was. She said, "You, a Jew." But she didn't let that stop her from speaking with him. She could have let that be a hurdle, ignored him, walk away. Sure, she must have been surprised to see a Jew inside their borders. Sure, there had to have been occasional times when their people would cross paths, but Jews typically didn't go that deep into Samaria. This was unique. This was different. This was very strange. Normally, they crossed the River Jordan, like I mentioned earlier, went north and then cut back west again. They went around Samaria. It took more time, especially with their mode of travel back then. Horses if you were rich, donkeys if you were okay, walking if you were everybody else. But the extra time Just proves how much they detested the Samaritans and didn't want to spend time with them. You getting the picture of the differences between them, the hurdles, the cultural differences, the things that were in the way of the conversation that she did not let get in the way? She didn't let that stop her from speaking with him. She thought he was just another Jew, and that would have been reason for her to shut down, draw her water, and leave. But she took Jesus' request for water as the invitation that it was and made space in her day to engage with him. She was also caught up in the world. She said, "You have nothing to draw water." But she wanted more. As was common for those around Jesus, she got stuck in the physical world when Jesus was speaking about higher things. It's a pretty big pattern. She did it. The disciples did it. The Pharisees did it. People everywhere he went, even those closest to him, got stuck in the physical world. He asked her for a drink of water, which made sense, but then he offered her water. And she kept thinking about what? About the well. He was speaking of a connection to God through the Holy Spirit and life beyond death, but she was stuck. It's like little Timmy fell down a well. He fell down a well so far he couldn't see the outer world. Lassie had to go and save the day. She was so far down the well, she couldn't see the reality that was crashing in on her. She couldn't think past the well water that kept death at bay and at the same time was part of the world that was killing her slowly. Does food give you everlasting life? A burger, does that keep you going? Maybe for a little while. Does it make you live forever? No, it just kind of fends it off for a little while, fends off death. Water does the same thing. Does it give you eternal life? No, not well water. It fends off death for a little while. Jesus was not talking about well water. But once she understood that he was from God, because she called him prophet in that moment, she brought up the question of where they ought to worship God. She was concerned with the mountain above, right there in Samaria, where they worshiped, and Jerusalem to the south, where the Jews said that they should worship. Again, she was caught up in the world and the things of the world. But Jesus responded by saying, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know," the Jews, "for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." He's redirecting her out of the world to higher things, things that are more core to our existence, what God made us to be. She also knew that her people's worship was not perfect. She said, "Messiah will tell us all things," but she still sought God. She just asked Jesus about proper worship, so she obviously has some care about God, despite the rest of her life. After Jesus tells her that the place where they worship is really of no concern to the Father, she replies, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." See, she points to the same figure that the Jews do, the Messiah, God's anointed one who will save his people. A Samaritan woman, in her position in life, points to the Messiah. She knows that God is valuable. She wants God's intervention. Due to their shared heritage with the Jews, she has faith that the Messiah is coming even to them. She recognizes the love of God better than the Jews do in this moment. Because one, she knows that worship requires fixing by the Messiah. She also knows that God hasn't cast out the Samaritans in the cold forever. I think the Jews kind of missed it on both of those points. You see a recurring pattern that Jesus points to a non-Jew. There are several Romans. Your faith has healed you, your son as well. Your faith has healed your son. These things, the centurion at the cross, truly this was the Son of God. He wasn't a Jew. People outside of Israel recognize Jesus in ways that often his brethren never did. Those bloodlines don't mean a thing. What they valued, their divisions, didn't mean a thing. It was about worshiping in spirit and truth, not about a mountain or Jerusalem. It's about none of those things. She wants more of God, and what she has isn't enough, but she has faith that God will provide, and she looks forward to that provision. So she was real, she engaged. Third, she responded. How did she respond? First, she responded to the truth. The simplest thing to recognize is that she literally responded to the truth. For he was sitting right in front of her. Later in John's gospel, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. This fits exactly with what he's telling her here in this moment. Sorry, I just got lost. There it is. She was standing there engaged in conversation with the truth. That's who she was responding to. Whether she knew it or not, she was literally responding to the truth of God. And Jesus knew that despite her faults, she was honest. She'd been truthful with him several times, consistently. Note that when he tells her that she has no husband, he commends her for telling the truth. He begins with, you are right in saying. Now, the word right there for right, it's commonly translated as well, as in, you have spoken well. Once in a while we say that, right? You've spoken well. You're a well-spoken person. He immediately acknowledges the truth of her words, and he reiterates this by finishing with, what you have said is true. Jesus knew that she would respond to the truth, and he leveraged that when he engaged with her. So she responded to the truth. Second, she responded to God. Now, there was a notable switch in how she spoke to him about halfway through the conversation, again tied to this moment of Jesus' knowledge about her past life. Her first word in response is, sir. Oh, that's not a big deal, Ben. You might be thinking, I say sir all the time to the people I know. Okay, yes, that's true. We use sir a lot of the times to show respect and these things. But remember the context here. She, a woman of ill reputation, even among the Samaritans, is speaking with a man, a Jew, who claims that he can do crazy things like give her water, though he has no well of her own or so much as a spoon to serve it with. This is not a guy you'd be typically calling sir. You'd say, hi, mister, something like that. But a second more important point, in this case, the word sir is not like our word for sir. This word translated here as sir is the Greek word kurios. Kurios. Now, some of you might recognize it, and others in this room might feel like you've heard it somewhere, and that's because you probably have. This is the word that appears in the Bible 54 times, and is translated as Lord, lowercase l. Master is the meaning of it. Someone who operates authority and control over me. 54 times, that's the second most used translation. The first most used translation is a whopping 667 times. Capital L, Lord, referring to God. Kurios. This word, while she may not have been calling him God in the moment, it meant a lot more to them than us using the word sir. She recognized that he was from God. She recognized he had authority, spiritual authority. And she changed how she spoke with him. She couldn't speak with him on the phone. She'd actually used it once before, possibly as sarcasm, but given the context, it was probably a recognition that first time as just his higher status as a male Jew as opposed to her low status as a Samaritan woman. Here, her bearing shifts as she says, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." The revelation of his connection to God caused an immediate change in her perception of him. For God's sake, she began treating him differently. So responded to the truth, she responded to God, and she also responded to the Messiah. After all this, she points to her firm expectation that the Messiah will one day set things straight, even for the Samaritans. And Jesus, seeing the conversation, has borne fruit that was ready for harvest, finally speaks the words, "I who speak to you am he." This is a huge revelation. Her people had been waiting for him for generations, and they'd heard no news of even the Jews receiving a visit from the Messiah. Yet here he sat, making time for her in the heat of the day, at an odd time of day, in a strange land, for her, of all people. This is huge. I can only imagine the explosion of sensations that had to be going off in her head of what all of this meant. I'm sure she remembered teachings from spiritual leaders, conversations with perhaps old friends and family, and the general culture of anticipation that were probably all seeming more real now than they had ever felt before. The promise of God was breathing the same air as her and asking her for a drink of water. What might this mean for her future? What might this mean for her neighbors? What might this mean for her world, even the entire known world beyond her home? Take a look at this clip of what that moment may have looked like for her.
This Messiah you speak of, I am he. The first one was named Ramin. You were a woman of purity who was excited to be married. But he wasn't a good man. He hurt you. And it made you question marriage and even the practice of your faith.
Stop it.
The second was Farzad. On your wedding night, his skin smelled like oranges. And to this day, every time you pass by the oranges in the market, you feel guilty for leaving him. Because he was the only truly godly man you've been with. But you felt unworthy.
Why are you doing this?
I have not revealed myself to the public as the Messiah. You are the first. It would be good if you believed me.
You picked the wrong person.
I came to Samaria just to meet you. Do you think it's an accident that I'm here in the middle of the day?
I am rejected by others.
I know. But not by the Messiah.
And you know these things because you are the Christ. I'm going to tell everyone.
I was counting on it.
Spirit and truth.
Spirit and truth.
It won't be all about mountains or temples.
Soon, just the heart.
You promise.
I promise.
This man told me everything I've done. Oh, he must be the Christ.
Hey, wait!
You what there?
You forgot your,
Come see a man who told me everything I ever did.
Rabbi, we got food. What would you like?
Ah. I have food to eat that you do not know about. Who got you food?
Who got you food? It's a lovely little touch at the end. That clip was from a show called The Chosen, a modern retelling of the story of Jesus. I highly recommend it, but do keep in mind that these are people writing scripts and interpreting scripture. So do keep in mind their thoughts will always be flawed to some degree, just as yours and mine. This is not scripture, but it can be helpful for study and for insights. It is free to watch online and included in some streaming services, so if you're interested after church, just let me know and I can point you the right direction. So what did she do in that moment? She dropped her jars and ran back to town, telling everyone she knew about the man she had just met. She responded immediately to the Messiah when she realized it was him in front of her. And she shared her faith with everyone who would listen. So what do we take away from her story? We ought to be real, engage, and respond, just as her. We should be real as this woman was. Honesty is critical. Hiding behind a mask and not letting people in can only isolate you. We're called to community, and we're called to holiness at the same time. When we come to understand that holiness is critical to our community, we often instinctively try to hide our flaws. But another critical part of our community is supporting one another. And we can't do that if we pull ourselves back from community and if we hide. There's no support available because it's not even known that it's needed. The solution is to understand who you are, to be honest with yourself, and to be honest with others. Only then can deep community truly grow. We should also engage as this woman did. Imagine the opportunity this woman had to spoil her moment. She had all sorts of barriers between herself and everyone around her, whether in bloodline or spiritual purity, social status, or anything else. Just as many held to a truer religion than she. Even Jesus said that the Jews worshiped what they knew while she did not. She suddenly had something that others didn't. She was the first human being on earth outside of Jesus' inner circle who he revealed himself to. That is a big, big deal. He even said it in the clip. I'm glad they included that. Because of what she had that others did not, she had the chance to snub those who looked down on her or to draw back from those she didn't feel a connection to, for whatever reason. Matthew Henry was a Welsh preacher from the 17th century, and he wrote a bit on this subject. He says, "If men, because one worships at one temple and another at another, will deny the offices of humanity and charity and common civility, will be morose and unnatural, scornful and censorious, and this under color of zeal for religion, they plainly show that however their religion may be true, they are not truly religious, but pretending to stickle for religion, subvert the design of it." In other words, if you claim to follow God, but you don't love as he does, you do not prove God false, you prove yourself to be false. Have you ever heard the term, "don't shoot the messenger"? That's what he's talking about. That's what he's talking about. So never mind the barriers, and love others as God first loved you. That's the standard. That's the standard we hold ourselves to. Third, we should respond to this as this woman did. The gospel comes in stages. It spreads by messengers and then is firmly grown by God himself. The Samaritans believed the word of the woman when she testified of Jesus, but when they met him and truly became his followers by knowing him and not merely hearing about him. We can't stop at that first stage. People can't just hear and believe. They have to continue to meet Jesus. That is the first step. Blessed are those who hear and believe, but they need to finally meet God. Hearing isn't enough. Knowledge about isn't enough. We get stuck in our heads sometimes. I know about God. Do you know about God or do you know God? Those are not the same. Those are not the same. Our job is to introduce people to Jesus, not to be the go-betweens. We're messengers for the purpose of introduction so that others might become fully devoted followers once they see Jesus for who he is. She didn't go study 12 steps to direct others to Jesus before she went. She didn't wait until she knew how to lead a Bible study before sharing the gospel. She didn't sit down to plan who she'd invite. She didn't even sanitize her own story. She told her own story and she made the introduction. Her story didn't hurt her testimony. It helped her testimony. Those things that we try to hide, our flaws, they can help. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a perfect man like me? No, a wretch like me. God saves wretches, and wretches witness. That's who God uses. That's our job. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't put unnecessary requirements on yourself and delay. Just go and do it. Be brave in sharing your faith. This is how the church honors the Great Commission and makes disciples as Jesus commanded. We go and we tell. Now, part of knowing Jesus, part of being connected with God, is being in communion with him. That word has lots of layers of meaning, and it's used in lots of ways. But one critical one is what we do here on Sundays every week, and that is to receive communion together. Jesus laid down his life, and he provides for us a way to the Father. We remember this, we celebrate it, we engage with it every week. The body and the blood, as we see in the bread and the cup. So today, as you go to the table, on the sides and in the center here, remember that you don't have to be perfect. God doesn't expect you to be perfect. But he does expect you to be honest, to engage, to respond. Come with you. Bring you to the table. And then run away, changed, and sharing what good news we have. That we don't have to stay wretches. We don't have to stay outcasts. That God loved you enough to come and meet you where you were, to find you, to save you. So come to the tables and receive.